We're going to just talk about putting together a magic yarn ball.
Great.
So you have gathered a collection of blues and greens from your yarn stash,
Yes.
and you have a bunch of different weights and textures,
Right.
and now you're going to put them together.
Yes, and figure out the order and the weights next to each other and all that is very confusing. So I'm
Okay.
looking forward to your help on that.
So my suggestion is to organize the yarn in sort of a grid, in that because you have a lot of this sort of lovely teal color, and then you have some of these really pretty greens, and then you have some multicolor things thrown in there. So to sort of go from heaviest weight down to lightest weight, but then keep them within the color area. Also worsted. So you really only have one DK. Everything else is worsted or light bulky, and then you have two that are finer weight.
Right.
So before we talk about how we can incorporate these into that, let's talk about what you think your final project is going to be with this.
Let's say the shawl.
A shawl? Okay, excellent. So if you know what your final outcome, whether it be a scarf or a shawl, then from there you can think, what is going to be the care and maintenance of that project? If it had been a sweater, then, which would be very interesting, but involve a whole lot more, then you would have to really consider, your fiber content, because mixing multiple fiber contents just adds to the dimension of the care for that, and having to be even more careful, making sure it's hand wash versus machine wash. So if you had a lot of yarns and fibers that were machine washable, but then you threw in like a silk and a cashmere somewhere in there, it would no longer be machine washable, of course.
Okay.
So, but here you have a wide variety of things. Most of these things probably have hand wash as their care instructions anyway. And with a shawl, that is going to be something that you're more likely to hand wash and probably not have to wash frequently. Okay.
So as long as the care is toward the most fragile yarn that you're using, doesn't matter if you throw in a man-made or an acrylic or something like that.
Exactly.
It's not going to destroy the integrity of the project.
It would become more of a factor if, for instance, you were going to make a magic ball that's going to become a baby blanket. Then you would want to make sure that all of your yarns and all of your fibers were machine washable. Now that you have it kind of laid out in colors, and you have a pretty good mix of different things, most of the things are in that worsted to light bulky. And as such, you could do one strand of any and then switch to a new strand and so forth and so on, with the exception of these two. Now you could take this for a bit somewhere in the middle of something else going on. And obviously when you would be knitting on the shawl, then you would have an area that it looks more cobwebby, because it's going to be more open, because you're not going to switch needles when you get to this particular yarn. But you could bulk up this yarn by adding it with something else. And for instance, even though it's similar to all of these colors over here, it might be kind of fun to add it to something like this along the way. When you're switching from, say, something like this, then you could have these two for a bit, and then switch over to something else, like maybe in one of the other greens or something along those lines.
Okay, so fading it in.
Fading it in. Mm-hmm. You could also double strand this, which isn't going to, it's probably going to take you to about a DK. Or you could combine maybe even these two together.
Well, as you said that, I was thinking, when I've double stranded these before, I drew from the center and from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So you could double strand both of them and put them together.
You could.
And then you might have almost a DK weight.
Absolutely.
Or a worsted weight, because it does have a bit of a halo.
Yes,
being alpaca.
yes. And I think even just, like the two strands together, you could probably work that in because it has that halo.
Now there's nothing here that's as thin as anything on this table. This is obviously thick. This is ribbon. This is boucle, much like this Cushendale.
Mm-hmm.
This is the...
Oh, a chenille like that, right?
And then this is the fuzzy. But this, I just did this as a swatch to see how they gauged up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that works to... I can knit down or I can knit up. And that works on either side just to test it before you go and commit yourself to the ball.
Yes. Yeah, that was a very clever idea. I love that you have a set of needles on each end that you can kind of keep bouncing back and forth to add where you think things need to be added. And so you can see in something that is a bulky weight. What size needles are you
using? These are 11s.
11s, okay.
Yes.
That it has a closer texture. Mm-hmm. And then when you get into yarns that would typically use a needle size that's a little less than that it opens up somewhat, which works great on a shawl. So one thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to have bulkier yarns, and because most of these fit into that worsted to bulky, I would definitely not do anything less than 11, and possibly for a shawl, because it's fine to have it all nice and open, maybe a 13 or a 15 as a base.
I think you're right.
And you will have spots that, for instance, if this didn't have the fuzz on it and it was just that core strand that's in there, that this would be a much more open thing, the way that these yarns are going to be in that shawl. And the other thing to remember too is that those bulkier, fluffier yarns, even on a larger needle, because they fill in the space, that you may want to use smaller bits of this at a time.
That's a good idea. I was just thinking that same thing, that these are obviously all the same number of yards.
Okay, so you did 10 yards or 9 yards?
9 yards. So I thought to myself, well, that's an interesting effect, but I don't really like it for what we're talking about. I'd rather have one or two rows, like go out and back and then pick up the next yarn.
Right.
And mix it up like that. So this just gave me an idea of how these yarns would work out.
You could knit a shawl without making these into a magic ball first and doing what you were saying, knit a couple of rows, drop that yarn, pick up a new yarn, knit a couple of rows back and forth that way. But that means having to, if you take this project on the go, gathering all these yarns, and then they get tangled in the bag and all that. So the joy of the magic ball is that it just kind of changes when it wants to change, and you just have to live with the change. Or, if you're kind of tired of the yarn that's on there, you break it at that point and roll up until it gets to a new yarn and join that way as well.
Another question.
Sure.
How do I know I have enough here to make a shawl? I like a wide shawl. It doesn't have to be deep, but it has to be at least 66 to 70 inches wide at the widest part.
If it's going to be that nice big open type of thing, then you need less yarn than if it were going to be knit on a smaller gauge.
Okay.
So that's a plus, because we've already determined that probably a 13 or a 15 is going to be your needle size for this project. It looks, you can look at some patterns and see how much yardage they are requiring and just sort of guesstimate throughout. But you have like a full skein of the Cushendale, and that is 200 meters. And you have a full skein of this, or probably a full skein. And there we go, 125 yards.
I think a shawl minimum is 600.
600, that's what I would say.
Would be more like it if I wanted a bigger shawl.
So it looks, just based on that, we're already, practically halfway there, just looking at 3 skeins of yarn if we looked at this one. So you should have plenty.
Oh, great.
So my suggestion is, because you have a few, we'll call them novelty things that have multi-colors in, plus this I would almost count as a novelty, even though it's a single color more or less, but it has some texture to it. I guess this would fall in the same type of thing, is that you use, and you have a little bit less of those types, except for this one, that you would use smaller bits of that. So you might do a yard or two of one of these, but you might do 4, 5, 6, 8 yards of some of the others. So you'll get some definite patterning with that. To a magic ball, I know there are magic balls out there that you'll go for a while and it'll be this, and then it switches to this, and then say to that, and you don't really necessarily come back to something that was in there previously. But when you're making your own, it's a good idea to kind of spread the love of each of the yarns throughout the entire magic ball.
Now, do you do this on an interval, like in an order, like say this, 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 and this, round
you
and round?
Can, and because you have a triangular piece that you're making, the while the order will be the same, its sort of placement will bounce all over because your rows are getting longer and longer. Where on the swatch that you were doing, it was rectangular, and so it would be easily seen as being repetitive.
I gotcha.
Which would work if that was the look that you were going for. Where in the shawl, it's because of the change in the number of stitches per row, then when you had 5 yards of this piece more toward the beginning, you'll get maybe a definitive stripe. Later on, those 5 yards might only make it half a row.
I see. We would start here and do all the blues coming down to this, and then do the greens.
You could do it that way, and that would make a really pretty gradual shifting type of thing. That would be very pretty. Or you can mix them all up. So it's totally up to you how you want to filter those in. If you want to do the graduated thing, then you really do have to spend a little more time kind of making sure that, and you mentioned maybe starting out with or ending with this. So once you kind of, somewhere in here, you're going to want to throw in a little bit of that and this. And even though these would kind of keep repeating for a while, there's going to be some intermittent ones that kind of cross over and bridge from the blues here to the greens. This is a perfect example of something that's going to, and this light blue in here too, and maybe even this mintier green, because it lends itself in before we start to get into the darker things. And this is another good transitional piece too. And I liked these two together because they really do bridge.
Me too.
Holding those two strands. And then I think these work as well. This one, which has some of that bright green that goes in, is another good one that helps to transition through. So if you did want to do that sort of blue to green or green to blue, either direction, then laying them out this way, you can kind of, play around with these back and forth, and then you start to add a little bit more from here and a little less from this area. You go stranding back and forth with here, and then shifting to here and shifting to the end. That way.
So maybe end up with this.
Ending up with that, with a few of these still kind of bopped in there.
I'm seeing these fuzzy ones as a shot here and there, but not as a big block, because they overwhelm and overpower. With
yes,
their
they do.
alone.
They tend to.
And they weight it down in that one
they
spot.
They do. Yeah, a little of this goes a long way.
Well, I'm thinking as we talk here and I look at this more and more, that rather than going from the blue to the green, I'd rather have more of a rhythm within the pattern.
Okay.
And have it an overall blue-green
all over. I think so.
More of a completely green on one end and blue on the other.
I think that would work, especially since you have some of these, we'll call them heavy yarns that,
they're all greens.
Yes, that are in the greens. I think that would work to intersperse them.
So shall we make a ball of some of these, knit up a swatch and come back and
So now we're back and we're going to put together sort of a mini ball to see how it goes. And you've decided that you're going to cast on and bind off with this bamboo yarn. So we had 2 of those, and we're holding one aside as the cast on, cast off. This one can be blended into the thing. But we know that since you're casting on with this, the next yarn should work well with this particular color.
Okay.
And we're thinking of doing the 2 strands of these lovely hand-dyed alpaca. So because this is going to be thinner than, it's going to be the thin part where some of these are the, the super thick part, then I wouldn't do like gobs of this, especially at the beginning. You would maybe do a couple of yards and then start with something else. And here we have one of the finished skeins. And here is the finished shawl. And you can see the flags from one of the novelty yarns that were used, but also some of those little bits coming off are from where yarns were joined together. And it all works out really great.